Welcome to Top 5 Final Fantasy. I'm Nafgwe from Birds of Play, and in this video, we're going to be ranking the top 5 opening cinematics from the Final Fantasy series. Usually, one of the problems with ranking all things Final Fantasy is that the series consists of a large number of games that have been released over a long period of time, meaning that it's not reasonable to expect that everyone has played every single entry in the series. This is why the topic of this video is so ingenious, because no matter which Final Fantasy game you've played or haven't played, we're only going to be discussing the beginning of each title. And who knows, maybe you'll be inspired to play a game you haven't played before, or more likely, restart a game that you've been playing on and off for the last 20 plus years. Don't worry, I'm not here to judge you, I'm just here to judge the opening cinematics. If you end up liking the video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and join the Birdhouse, becoming a part of our growing Final Fantasy family. Also, if you have an idea for some other interesting top 5 topics that might help us engage with Final Fantasy in novel and interesting ways, don't forget to leave us a comment down below. We would love to make your suggestions a reality. But now, without further ado, let us raise the curtain on the top 5 opening cinematics from the Final Fantasy series. Number 5. Final Fantasy VI. The Final Fantasy franchise has always had a flair for the cinematic, even before the games featured pre-rendered cutscenes. Regardless of technical limitations, however, the opening cinematic of Final Fantasy VI, wherein 3 sets of Magitech armor can be seen marching through the snow, manages to do very much with very little, creating an iconic and atmospheric scene simply by using the overworld map as a basis. Although this scene doesn't have any wide-reaching implications for the game as a whole, it sets the tone for the game's opening and uses cinematic techniques to tell the player that Final Fantasy VI is a game worth taking seriously. Number 4. Final Fantasy XII. 6 plus 6 might equal 12, but the opening cinematic of Final Fantasy XII has very little in common with the opening of Final Fantasy VI. Aside from Final Fantasy XI, Final Fantasy XII was the first game to feature an opening cinematic with spoken dialogue. However, just like in the case of film history, as film left the silent era and tackled a brave new world of sound, the introduction of spoken dialogue can be said to have been a little bit of a double-edged sword. For one thing, the spoken delivery of information often comes at the cost of visual intrigue and visual storytelling. Thankfully, in the case of Final Fantasy XII, the opening manages to strike a good balance between showing and telling by keeping the dialogue to a minimum. This gives the game an opportunity to show Final Fantasy's love for the Star Wars series by recreating familiar scenes from the Phantom Menace within the world of Ivalice. Just kidding, or am I? More importantly, however, it sets up the historical backdrop for the game in a matter of minutes and hints at a level of political depth that has been mostly absent from the series. This game is going to be different from the Final Fantasy games that came before it, and it's not afraid of telling us. Number 3. Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VII's opening cinematic is as iconic as they come, making use of the capabilities of the new PlayStation hardware in order to deliver a pre-rendered cinematic unlike anything the series had offered before. In the first few seconds, the opening serves as a microcosm of the game's major environmental themes by having us consider the interconnectedness between the cosmos itself, the planet, and last but not least, the human element of it all, with Aerith's face emerging from the darkness that the light from the stars and the planet's lifestream couldn't fully illuminate. As if that wasn't iconic enough, we are then treated to the digital camera accomplishing one of the most impressive zoom shots in the history of cinema, as we move all the way from a dark alleyway into a wide shot that encompasses the entire city. And what a city it is! But as instantly iconic as the city of Midgar is, the cityscape is as dystopian as it is sublime, hinting at the fact that something must be done, and maybe we are the person to do it. Finally, we see a train arriving at its destination, where the pre-rendered cinematic merges seamlessly with the in-game graphics, or almost seamlessly. Regardless of such minor technical hiccups, however, the opening cinematic of Final Fantasy VII remains an important milestone not only for the Final Fantasy series, but also for the trust placed in video games as a medium for storytelling. Number 2. Final Fantasy X. For many players, watching Final Fantasy X's opening cinematic was the moment the sophistication of the computer-generated imagery on display caught up with their dreams. It might not be on par with the best graphics have to offer nowadays, or what they will be capable of in the future, but it nevertheless represents a significant step forward for the series in regard to realistic renditions of people and places. Just look at that water. Just look at Tidus. Just look at Tidus in the water. Just look at Tidus out of the water. Just look at Auron standing at the top of a tall building, raising a toast to what appears to be an incoming tidal wave, in a shot that is as cool as it is packed with hidden meaning. As an introduction to the game, the scene introduces us to Tidus not only at home in the water, but also at home in a futuristic metropolis wherein he has made a name for himself as a star Blitzball player. As the scene progresses, however, we see how his world crumbles before his very eyes, which seems fitting in a way, since as a stranger in the foreign land of Spira, Tidus' worldview repeatedly gets challenged as he is forced to find out that things don't work like they did back home. Honorable mentions. Final Fantasy. You know the first one? Honorable mentions this time around go to the Heroes on the Hill from the original Final Fantasy. A still image that is little more than a delayed title card with some exposition and credits for the game. It might not look like much, but it's notable for at least two reasons. Firstly, displaying the title card and the credits after some time has already passed is a recognizably cinematic technique, signaling to the player, just like so many openings that followed in its wake, that this wasn't just any other game. Secondly, featuring the credits so prominently drew attention to the creators themselves, telling the player that this was a game artistically crafted as opposed to simply being soullessly produced. Since then, decades have passed, but the initial promise set forth in the original Final Fantasy has been made good on time and time again, making the cinematic an integral part of the Final Fantasy experience, and something the franchise continues to be celebrated for to this day. Number 1. Final Fantasy VIII. After the success of Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VIII had some big shoes to fill. Luckily, the developers of Final Fantasy had learned a lot from their first foray into the world of 3D, and now it was time to start capitalizing on it by making one of the most captivating opening cinematics in the history of video games. Say what you will about the game itself, the opening of Final Fantasy VIII featured stunning visuals and a superb musical score that elicited an emotional reaction and a sense of awe that wasn't commonly attributed to video games at the time. The opening scene plays a little bit like a music video or an advertisement for the game, with seemingly random scenes jumbled together, yet ultimately converging on two figures locking blades. The true meaning of the opening isn't revealed until a lot later in the game, so upon first viewing, the mystery of it all might come across as somewhat nonsensical, or simply as a spectacle for the sake of spectacle. However, even devoid of its ulterior meaning, the scene even holds up as a pure spectacle, by having some of Nobuo Uematsu's best work as a composer accompanying some of the most revolutionary visuals of the time. Then, once you're made aware of the significance of the opening, the scene takes on yet another meaning, making for a perfect beginning to a game some fans would be playing again and again, maybe even for the rest of their lives.
Hey everyone, it's me, the other one. Thanks for watching. If you liked what you saw, please subscribe, click the bell, leave a comment, and, come now, make bird sounds with us.